Hello and welcome to this presentation on working with value in Photoshop. Let's begin with a quick definition of what we mean by the term value. The word value in general parlance means a shade of a color, that is, a lighter or darker version of a color. So what we really mean is, for example, if we took red and said what's a value of red, well, if we mixed a little bit of white with it, we'd kind of get a pinkish looking color. That's a value of red. If we mixed some black with it, we'd get a dark red. But it's still in essence the same red, it's just lighter or darker because of an amount of black or white we've added to it. Value often is measured in sort of terms of percentages. So 100% is the pure color, and often we mean black. 50% is a medium shade of the color, and then 10% would be a very light color or gray. And generally, value in the world of graphic design refers to gray instead of color. An interesting sort of variant on human perception is that we really don't have the ability to measure things perceptually in absolute sense. We can't say this is, there's no perceptual mechanism that says this is 17% black. What we can do is sort of do comparisons. So we can say about 10%, about 20%. Of course, there are scientific instruments that will do that for us, but that's not our mechanism. So what we have is a comparative perceptual mechanism. We can say that's lighter than this, darker than that, and that's why we use sort of very coarse or loose measurements like these big percentages. There are lots and lots of color tools in Photoshop, and we're really going to be focusing on three ways of working with color today, and to say that we're scratching the surface doesn't even really do Photoshop justice. In the early days of these tools, back in the early late 80s, early 90s, there were programs like Pixel Paint and Color Studio that were better than Photoshop 1. It wasn't called Photoshop 1, it was just called Photoshop. But by version 2 of Photoshop, it had sort of dominated the market because it was such a major upgrade, and it added tools that nobody had ever thought of before. And it was just sort of a dazzling thing to see all these colors on a computer screen. They didn't exist up until that point. The best color systems out had, you know, a handful of colors, and then suddenly Photoshop comes on the market with 16.7 million colors. That's sometimes called 24-bit color, and we won't go into all the technical terms there, but if you took 2 and raised it to the 24th power, 2 to the 24th is 16.7 million colors. But in actuality, Photoshop is what's called a 32-bit color program. And that means that of those 16.7 million colors, there's also 256 possible levels of transparency or opacity. So Photoshop is either a 24-bit or a 32-bit program, depending how you define it. But there's just no way the human imagination can look at 16.7 million colors and keep anything like that straight. But we'll see how Photoshop allows us to work with all of the possible colors in nature. In fact, 16.7 million colors are more colors than are found in nature, and far more colors than can be reproduced on paper, but we'll see how we can manage those in just a moment. So we'll be working with the color picker, which is the sort of ordinary way that we quickly bring up a screen that allows us to navigate amongst those 16.7 million colors. We'll also work with the color palette, which allows us to manage colors that we need in a particular project and use a deliberately chosen subset of those 16.7 million colors. We'll also see how the eyedropper tool works. Not all that useful for our work in these exercises, but very useful when you're working with photographs. But there are many, many more colors, hundreds of more color tools to work with in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. Let's go out to Photoshop Elements now and see how the color picker, color palette, and eyedropper work to help us manage color. So here I am with one of my images open in Photoshop Elements, and you can see the color picker is this 2 swatch tool down in the lower left corner of my screen here. And it actually consists of 4 tools in one. There's the default color button, and if I click on that, the foreground color is reset to black and the background is reset to white. This little arrow, double-headed arrow in the upper right-hand corner is to switch between the foreground and the background. And then each one of the swatches themselves is a tool. So if I go back to my default colors and I select black, click on the foreground tool, it's going to bring up my color picker. It always comes up to red, and I can move my selector around And notice what's happening in my window. It's doing a whole bunch of stuff. It's first of all showing me my before color, black, and my current color, red, this kind of rose colored. And it's showing me what the nearest web color is. And that's kind of useful. There are 216 web safe colors that all browsers. This is kind of getting a little arcane, because now with modern computers, very few people feel locked into those original 216 colors. But there are some video cards and some browser setups that will only display those 216. So if you're being very conservative and working on the web, you only use the 216 web safe colors. A little bit of esoterica that's kind of beyond us today. So I can move over. If I want just gray, I'll stick all the way over to the left, and I'll move up and notice that there's nothing that looks like red in my selector. I'm going from white all the way down to like a 50% gray, and then all the way down to 100% gray, which is black. So if I wanted to select a yellow, same idea. I can move any place on here from no yellow to fully saturated yellow, all the way up in the upper right hand corner. Now if I did want to say only web safe colors, it's going to force all of those colors into the 216 web safe colors, and that's really frustrating for most designers. For example, Kent's colors are blue and gold, and I can get to Kent State's blue pretty easily. That's going to be something like this, but gold is pretty tricky. There really aren't a lot of yellows to choose from, and we might get to this one maybe, and that's pretty bright orange, and there really isn't a good gold, and that's a complaint. That's just kind of dark orange, almost a brown. So people complain about the web-safe colors because they don't represent the full color spectrum that you need, and that's why a lot of people have kind of abandoned that, even though it's the most conservative and safe way of working with color for the web. But that's our color picker. We won't use web-safe colors. Choose any color you want, and when I choose that color, this light blue is going to be saved over onto my foreground color. But as we just saw, that's one of 16.7 million colors, and it's kind of a nice blue. But what if I get kind of busy and do a whole bunch of other stuff? How do I remember which color that was? If I go back in, I might have, gosh, I might be up here instead, and that's just not the right color. So the color palette allows us to manage a subset of colors. So let's go up to the Window menu and select Color Swatches. And here are my color swatches, and these are the default colors. I can select just the Mac operating system colors, or Windows. They're not quite the same, or leave it as default. Now I have this shade of blue here, which is a little bit like these other shades of blue, but not quite. Mine's just a little darker in value. So if I want to add that to my color palette, all I have to do is click on the little new button, and it's added to the end. Now if I wanted to go out and find a green, kind of a mint colored green, I guess, I can add that as well. Again, a little different than anything in my color palette. There's some things that are close, but I'll just add that color as well. Now for problem 6 in value, we're going to be dealing with grays, and you might find that you have just the right shade of gray already in your color swatches and don't need to use the color picker. You can if you want, but you'll notice that you've got 10%, 50%. Our last color tool is the eyedropper tool, and that works best when we have an image with lots of different colors in it. But just to sort of illustrate it, we use the eyedropper tool and then hover over an area of color, and when we click on that, that gets sucked up and added to our foreground color. So we can find a color in an image and quickly add it to our foreground tool and then paint or draw with it or something like that. Not very exciting in black, but we can use the color very quickly. And it's kind of handy, although there are better ways of doing this. Let's say you were trying to retouch a photograph and there was a pretty face with a blemish. I can use the eyedropper tool and suck up some color from an area adjacent to the blemish and just paint over it and retouch it. There's a tool that does that automatically for us in Photoshop called, well, both of these tools, the Healing Brush tool and also the Clone Stamp tool, are really good retouching tools that do that automatically, that quickly sample adjacent colors with lots of complexity and then allow us to paint over in a very quick and seamless fashion to retouch a photograph. But in principle, the eyedropper tool does the same thing, grabs the color and allows us to then use any of the other drawing tools and use that color, apply that color to some other part of the image. So again, there are many different color tools in Photoshop. We have these magic wand tools to allow us to select areas by color. We can adjust color by auto color correction. We can adjust color manually, adjust the sharpness, which is really even a color tool, believe it or not. Contrast is a color tool. Lots and lots of different ways of working with color. In fact, that's really in essence just what Photoshop is a color correction tool, color application tool. A little bit beyond our scope today. We've got enough skills now to complete problem 6 and 7. So how do we use the paint bucket tool to shade objects in our drawings using Photoshop Elements? Well, basically there are just a few steps. First, we're going to begin by selecting the color from the picker, palette, or eyedropper. In other words, we have to have the right color or value loaded into our foreground color swatch. Then we have to select the area to be colorized, and then finally we just click in that selected area with the tip of the paint bucket. Now, the paint bucket is probably the most confusing tool. Where do you draw? With a pencil it's easy, the tip of the pencil. With a paintbrush, the tip of the paintbrush. But a paint bucket, well, it's the tip of the dripping paint. But for most people that's a little hard to get used to, so I want to just give you kind of a power user's tip in working with Photoshop. And that's if you use the caps lock key, the cursor will turn from the paint bucket, or any of the other tools for that matter, into a crosshair, and that crosshair precisely locates the action of the tool. So whether it's the paint bucket or the pencil or brush or whatever tool, the eraser is hard too. It's just a kind of a big rectangle. When you're using the eraser, it's a good tool to turn the cursor into a crosshair, and then you know exactly where to use the tool. And we'll see that in just a moment. So we're back in Photoshop Elements, and it's time to colorize using a value of gray. For problem 6, you're only allowed one, so pick one that you like. And my advice to you is to stick with a lighter shade of gray. Don't go too dark, so I would stay up in the top row here in my color swatches. And so maybe a 30%, 40%, 50% in that ballpark. I'll choose this one. And notice that that's loaded into my swatch. That's my first step, is I've selected the color. It's loaded in my foreground. I'm ready to use it. Now my second step is to select the object that I want to colorize. And in just a moment we'll be learning the keyboard shortcuts here, but let's do it manually at first. I'm going to use the Move tool. And if I hover over the tools in Photoshop, notice that in parentheses after the name of the tool is one letter. And that's the so-called one-letter shortcut. So in the case of the Move tool, the shortcut is V. Now, ordinarily, it's the first letter of the name of the tool, like the eyedropper. Oh, wait, I, because we've already used E. So they try to use the best substitute for the first letter if the E is already used, because the E, I think, is used for eraser. So we can't use E twice, so eyedropper. In the case of the Move tool, we've already used M for marquee, so we're going to use V because it's the next sort of strongest sound. Move, V. And that's kind of how I've exaggerated it in my own memory to remember it. The Move tool. Bucket, we've already used the B tool, so buck, K, is the next strongest consonant sound, and that's how we're going to remember that one. So for this exercise, it's really useful to know a few keyboard shortcuts. V for Move, that's one you've got to know. To work efficiently in Photoshop, you've got to know V for Move because you use the Move tool constantly. The paint bucket tool you may not use as often, but it's pretty easy to remember too. K for bucket, so we're going to remember that as K. I've selected my object. Let's colorize this guy, so I'm going to click with the Move tool to select it. And now I'm going to click on the paint bucket tool to select it, and then I'm ready to dump my paint into that area. And I mentioned a little, if you notice, there's a white pixel tip of the paint bucket tool, and that's where the paint will dump from. That's a lot to remember, and actually a lot to kind of position. That's why if you press the caps lock key, the paint bucket and any tool will turn into a crosshair, and then it becomes a lot easier to position. There's no doubt where that's going to do its action. So there's my caps lock on, and I've got gray. Let's do it the old-fashioned way one more time. Move tool. Let's click on this one. Click the paint bucket tool. With my crosshair still selected, colorize it. Now let's do the same thing using the keyboard shortcuts. V for Move. Click on what I want to colorize. K for bucket. click. V for move, click on what I want to colorize. K for bucket, and with the crosshairs I can even zap in the little guy. I want to do a couple more. V for move, select K for bucket, click. And let's do one more, this one here I think. V for move, click to select, K for bucket, click. And I've added value to my illustration. Now of course color would work the exact same way, and let's see how we might select a color. For problem 7, you're encouraged to use a primary color, and it's actually a primary pigment. The primary pigments are blue, yellow, and red. When you were a kid, you might have mixed tempera paints. You mixed blue and yellow and got green. You mixed red and yellow and got orange. Those are pigments, and the physics behind it isn't important here, but in the world of light transmission, like on a computer screen or video screen, the primary colors are actually red, green, and blue. But since we're dealing with something that ostensibly would be printed, the primary pigments, blue, red, and yellow. So I'm going to choose a yellow, and notice even in my color swatches it says pure yellow. That might be a little bright. You could use light yellow, really up to you. I'll just stick with the pure yellow for this exercise. You could use red, you could use blue from the swatches, but you could select your own. Just don't use a green, and don't use a purple, and don't use you know, like an orange or a gray or something like that. Stick with something like a red, something like a blue, and something like a yellow. Okay, so I've got my color swatch, yellow selected as my foreground color, and then it's the exact same process before. And let's review the old-fashioned way. Click on the Move tool. Click the thing I want to colorize. I'll do that one again. And the Paint Bucket tool. Click. Got my caps lock down. And now we'll do it fast using the keyboard shortcuts. V for move, click. K for Paint Bucket. 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 And I've changed my value to color. Well, the last thing we need to worry about now that we've added more value or color to our file is saving it correctly when we save it for the web. A couple of rules of thumb to remember. First, when you save for the web, make sure that you've adjusted the number of colors in the GIF palette high enough so that your colors actually display properly. You might get the wrong shade showing up, or worse yet, you might not see your shade at all if the colors are set too low. Because remember, if we had been setting the colors for 2 colors to accommodate just black and white, we won't see black, white, and yellow. There's only 2 colors. So we have to set the number of colors higher. And it's pretty easy to tell when it's working poorly. We'll get a dramatically bad color, or we'll get no color at all. And so you just increase the number of colors, and we'll see that shortly. But don't increase the color too high. Don't say 256 colors. There are subtle adjustments that you can make in Photoshop Elements to make that balance between the right number of colors just right, so it's not too many and not too few, sometimes called Goldilocks settings. You can set the Goldilocks settings and have just the right compromise between large number of colors and correct rendition of your image. And as always, be sure to preview your image on the web. The preview function in Elements works great, but just don't quickly turn it in, assume it's going to be fine, and then be disappointed when something is not working when it's out on the web. Take a quick look at your work after it's been posted. So let's see how we can save correctly as a GIF back in Elements. Okay, so we're back in Photoshop Elements, and we have now 3 colors to worry about: white, black, and yellow, as we save for a GIF. So let's go to File, Save for Web. And here we have the perfect illustration. If you notice, I've got my yellows showing up just fine. The before looks a lot like the after. I think this is going to be fine. But you might have had this situation where your colors were set to 2. And notice how magically all my yellows disappeared, because I've just set Elements to have black and white, 2 colors, no yellow. Now notice that right now it's saying 3.488K, down from 942. That's amazing. 30 times, if my arithmetic is correct, or is that 300 times? 300 times compression. Let's go to 256 colors, all possible colors, and notice that it almost doubles in size unnecessarily. You might not think that that's too much to worry about, but every little bit counts. The smaller the image, the faster the image will load and the better the user experience. So be careful here and work very carefully to make sure you optimize file size and number of colors. So let's go to 4 and see what happens. Remember at 2 it was 3.48, but I've got no colors. That's not very good. Let's go to 4 and it jumps to 4.2, but I've got all my colors. That's about the best compromise I'm going to get. So let's go ahead and say OK, and we're going to name our file according to the directions prob06 or prob07 A, B, C, or D, and I've already got that saved out here, so let's do it again. Yes, I'll replace it, and we're done. So with problem 6 we're going to make sure that we've added one shade of gray, and for problem 7 one color from the primary sort of venues of red, yellow, and blue.